Let's dive right into this explainer, where we're going to completely dismantle the popular myths surrounding pre-Islamic Mecca and uncover the brilliant, systemic machinery behind the Kaaba. You know, when we picture late antique Arabia, it's so easy to just imagine a barren desert filled with chaotic, random idol worship. But well, the historical sources reveal something entirely different. We are looking at a highly sophisticated world of sacred geography.
So, before we really get into the history, we have to stop and ask ourselves, is this story of a chaotic, primitive idol hub actually the full picture? I mean, think about it. If it was literally just a localized shrine with some stone figures, why on earth would tribes travel hundreds of miles through lethal, completely unpoliced deserts just to circle it? Why exactly did the Kaaba become the absolute, uncontested religious and economic center of Western Arabia?
It is absolutely fascinating to contrast our kind of cartoonish modern assumptions with the sophisticated geopolitical reality of late antiquity. The Kaaba, it wasn't just a temple. It was a deeply ingrained social institution. We're talking about a world where religion was the literal political infrastructure that kept a heavily fractured society from just falling apart.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the pagan Mecca myth. Second, the neutral zone known as the Hauta. Third, the Quraysh economic cartel. And finally, recoding the sacred geography. We're going to go from shattering old preconceptions right through to Islam's revolutionary reform of this space.
All right, moving into section 1, the pagan Mecca myth, and looking beyond those Greek-style statues.
We are always told that the Kaaba housed around 360 idols, but modern historical analysis suggests something way more interesting. These weren't just religious statues, they acted as diplomatic credentials. Think of them as physical representations of treaties between the Meccan Quraysh tribe and visiting clans. When a tribe placed their deity in the Kaaba, they weren't just, praying. They were effectively signing an ironclad pact of protection and trade.
And this perfectly highlights that Mecca definitely wasn't some gallery of carved marble figures. It was a sanctuary of sacred stones, including, of course, the famous black stone. This whole concept is part of a widespread Arabian lithic culture. The pre-Islamic Arabs didn't necessarily worship the stone itself. Actually, scratch that, it wasn't about the rock itself at all. These bayatils, or ansab, were focal points. They were physical anchors where people believed a divine presence could interact directly with the human world.
Okay, section 2, the neutral zone, also known as the Hauta. Let's look at the architecture of desert diplomacy. So the Kaaba sat right in the middle of a haram, or a hafta, in a highly fragmented, heavily armed peninsula that was constantly locked in endless cycles of vengeance. This violence-free zone was absolutely crucial. It was the essential political infrastructure that kept Arabian society from completely tearing itself apart. Inside this boundary, you couldn't hunt, you couldn't cut down sacred trees, and most importantly, you literally could not shed blood. Complete immunity.
By housing the sacred symbols of dozens of disparate tribes under one single roof, the Kaaba effectively served as this ancient international court of arbitration. I actually like to think of it as the United Nations of Arabia. Tribes that were absolute mortal enemies out on the desert sands could stand shoulder to shoulder inside the sanctuary, totally bound by the sacred, unbreakable law of the space.
But inside this UN, you still needed a supreme court. And that is exactly where the deity Hubal comes in. When tribes had a massive dispute over blood money, lineage, or trade, they didn't just pray to the idol Hubal hoping for the best. They used his aslam, these divination arrows, to officially settle the law. The oracle would cast the arrows, and whatever the result was, it was absolutely binding, no questions asked. If you remove Hubal and his arrows, the entire legal system of 7th century Mecca completely collapses. Which really changes how we view his role in the Kaaba, doesn't it? He wasn't just a god of thunder or war. He was essentially the chief justice in a society that didn't even have a written constitution. Now on to section 3, the Quraysh economic cartel, because we really need to talk about monetizing the sanctuary. Look, where there is guaranteed peace, incredibly lucrative markets are naturally going to flourish. And the custodians of the Kaaba, the Quraysh tribe, they understood this perfectly. They didn't just quietly host pilgrims out of the goodness of their hearts. They claimed a higher status of sanctity than all the other Arabs. They formed this super elite alliance called the Hums and weaponized purity laws to build a massive economic monopoly. They basically branded themselves as the exclusive religious aristocrat of the desert. And this is where you see how religion and economic strategy just brilliantly reinforced one another. turning the Quraysh into a highly sophisticated cartel. If you came to Mecca to perform the tawaf, the circling of the Kaaba, the Hums dictated that your everyday clothes from the outside were too polluted, so you had to buy their specially manufactured Meccan garments. And if you couldn't afford them, well, you were forced by law to perform the ritual completely naked. It was an incredibly ruthless monetization of sacred space, to say the least.
Let's move to our final section, Section 4, Recoding the Sacred Geography, how they transform the meaning while keeping the space.
So normally, conquering movements will just level the temples of their predecessors to build something entirely new on top of the ashes, right? But Islam executed this absolutely unprecedented strategy. It kept the physical infrastructure, the hardware, but it completely recoded the theology, the software.
When you break down these practices, you see that the rituals and the peace of the sanctuary were completely maintained, but the intermediaries were entirely purged. The meaning was exclusively anchored back to Abrahamic origins. The Kaaba remained a sanctuary, the Tawaf continued, and sacrifices were still made. But that elitism of the Hums completely demolished and replaced by the absolute equality of the Ummah, the global community of believers. All the idols were cleared out, and not just to smash statues, but to permanently fire the divine middlemen.
The crucial takeaway here is that Islam's reform wasn't about introducing the concept of God to atheists. Historical evidence strongly suggests pre-Islamic Arabs already knew of a high God, Allah. Islam's massive paradigm shift was really about abolishing the intermediaries, like those so-called daughters of Allah, and purifying the method of access. This wasn't just a minor religious update, it was a structural reform of the highest order.
By reclaiming and purifying the Kaaba, early Islam ensured that this emerging religious movement retained the absolute center of gravity of the Arabian world. They didn't just erase the sacred geography, they took an institution that was already keeping a fractured tribal society from collapsing, and they elevated it into the cornerstone of a unified, global monotheistic civilization. To put it simply, Islam did not break Arabia's sacred past, it reauthored it.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to ponder. If the ancient infrastructure of the sanctuary survived and was so effectively repurposed, what other daily Islamic practices hold echoes of Arabia's deep past? Just how much of the ancient world is still walking right alongside us today? It completely changes how you view history, doesn't it? Well, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into the sacred geography of the Kaaba has sparked your curiosity to keep exploring.